Given that we are discussing God in the framework of monotheism, which is the belief that there is only one God, it does not appear to be essential to assign him a particular name. Simply uttering the word God is sufficient to convey the specifics of what or who we are discussing. In contrast, individuals in the ancient world needed to be more explicit than that since they lived in a polytheistic society in which there were several gods. It was not sufficient to merely state, "I serve God." It was essential to elucidate the specific deity or deities that the individual chose to serve. Also, in order to do that, they needed to utilize particular names, right? The correct names. For this reason, for instance, we see individuals in the Bible discussing the god Baal, the god Dagon, the god Chemo, and of course, the God of Israel and Judah. Isn't that the case? God, who is also known by a particular name, is the God of Moses. At the beginning of the polytheistic world, he was one among the many gods that existed at the time. In order to better demonstrate this point, we may select a story from the Bible that describes a territorial conflict that occurred between two different peoples, namely the Israelites and the Ammonites. In this disagreement, an Israelite by the name of Jephthah asserts that the claim to the land originated from divine origin. Nevertheless, he does not assert that this land is mine since God gave it to me. He knows that he has to be more specific than that, so what he really says is the following: the land to which you Ammonites have a right is the land that your God that Moses gave to you, and the land to which we Israelites have a right is the land that our God. And then he says the proper name of this God gave to us, and I will not pronounce this name here yet so as not to waste any steps. We will do this throughout the video later on, but I can show you how this name was initially written, right? And using even the oldest archaeological record that we have of this name, and this record is this object that you are seeing there, which is the Moabite stone or stele of Mech. This is an artifact that dates back to the 9th century BC and is the oldest one that actually contains the name of the God of Israel. And interestingly, this artifact was not produced by Israelites. In fact, it is a Moabite artifact that commemorates the liberation of the kingdom of Moab in relation to the dominion of Israel. And what the text written on this artifact says is that the main god of Moab, who is Moab, had angry with his people in the past, and for that reason he had delivered these people into the hands of the Israelites. But sometime later a new Moabite king named Mea managed to regain the favor of the god Chemo and free himself from the oppression of Israel. And more specifically, this text also says that in this military victory of Moab against the Israelites, some objects linked to the worship of the tutelary god of Israel were taken and placed at the feet of Chemo, who was a tutelary god of Moab, this to affirm of course the superiority of this god in relation to the other, and in a certain way also the superiority of this nation in relation to the other. So it is precisely in this context, right, and speaking of this specific part of the objects of the temple of the god of Israel, that the Stele AD Mecca records what is the name of this god in this way that you are seeing there on the screen. Right, there are 4 letters in a variant of the Phoenician script that basically equivalent to the letters Yod, Vav, and Re of the modern Hebrew script. Again, this is the oldest archaeological record that we have of this name, 9th century before Christ. But in the following century we find other records also containing this name, like these inscriptions made on a vase found in Klet Adrud in the Sinai region. We also find the Yod He Vav He, or sometimes just Yod He Vav without the last letter. And from the 7th century onwards we have several other occurrences. They are already much more numerous than from the 9th and 10th centuries, and they even include short forms that mark the name of the God of Israel with just a Yod and a Re, or with a Yod and a Vav. So there were several ways of recording this name, but that's fine. The writing of this name was like this, but how was it pronounced? Well, here things start to get a little more complicated, right? It is necessary for us to confront at least 2 fundamental challenges in order to provide an answer to this issue. The first problem is a linguistic one. You are aware that there are so many letters, right? Both the Yod, Re, Vav, and the Re again are consonants in Hebrew lettering, exactly like any other letter in the alphabet. At the time, vowels were not indicated in writing, so most of the time the person only knew how to pronounce a word that they saw in a written text because they already knew that word by its use in oral language, and then through the context she recognized which word was recorded in writing and was able to pronounce that word correctly. But the problem with that is that if you lose the pronunciation in oral language, if that word stops being said, you can no longer discover just by its written form, its written record, what the pronunciation was, right? In order to prevent the pronunciation from being lost forever, it is essential that it be preserved through spoken language. What would you say happened, right? And now we get to the second obstacle with this pronunciation of the name, which is a historical challenge. This difficulty is that at a certain moment in the formation of the God of Israel and Judah, the tendency to avoid the pronunciation of the name of this God began to emerge. To begin with, this was not the situation. Is that correct? The reason for this is that we have discovered that this phrase is being utilized in a multitude of papers and publications, and it is even being used by those who are not native speakers of the language. Therefore, even people who are not exactly Israelites use the name of the God of Israel in insignificant contexts such as this one in order to communicate, to talk about who they are talking about. But really, at a certain point in history, this custom of avoiding this name begins to emerge, and this may have two main factors, right? This is not entirely clear in history, but there are two main factors generally pointed out by historians. The first may have been the adoption of an extremely zealous interpretation of the commandment, "You shall not take the name of your God in vain," which may have greatly discouraged the current use of this name, and the second may have been the consolidation of an understanding that divine names had certain magical powers, and that therefore they should not be known by just anyone. Whatever the case, the fact is that we find rabbinical texts from the first centuries that say that the divine name could only be pronounced on the day of Yom Kippur by the high priest inside the Holy of Holies, which was the holiest space in the Temple of Jerusalem. That is, a really practically absolute restriction on the use of this name, and there is also a Samaritan tradition that says that the divine name was only known by the priest who transmitted this name secretly to his successor, and this from generation to generation, so only the Samaritan high priests would know the name of God, and even in writing we see this process of restricting the use of the divine name happening mainly from the 3rd century before Christ onwards. The Jews who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek between the 3rd and the 1st century before Christ, they replaced all occurrences of the proper name of the God of Israel and Judah with the words Kyrios or Theos, that is, Lord or God respectively, and to this day, in fact, this tendency can still be seen in most Bibles, which usually replace the proper name with the word Lord or God, using this slightly different type of letter, which is the small caps. Even though this editorial option is stated in the introduction of the Bibles that do this, very few individuals actually end up reading this section and being aware that this alteration was made. The proper name of God does not exist even once in the New Testament canon. It is always Theos or Kyrios, which also correlate to the Hebrew phrases Adonai and Elohim, which had already begun replacing the usage of the proper name there. In other words, it is always Theos. We have this historical and documentary record of this practice of avoiding the use of the name of the God of Israel, which contrasts greatly, as I mentioned earlier, with what we find in the majority of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, which is that people use this name all the time, and even with foreigners, and even foreigners using the name. This practice has been going on since the 3rd century before Christ. Those texts don't give the slightest clue that there was an intention to avoid the use of the name. But regardless of what exactly were the reasons that led to this tendency to avoid the use of the divine name, the fact is that this, together with the impossibility of recording the pronunciation of this name in writing, because of that issue of the absence of vowels, meant that the preservation of the oldest forms of pronunciation of the name was greatly compromised. Even yet, there are still a few different ways that people know how to say this name nowadays. For instance, Yahoo Jehovah Yahoo is one of the ways that people pronounce this name. In any case, one may find a number of different pronunciations in use today. So, the question that we might ask now is, where did people obtain these pronunciations from? The answer comes primarily from two sets of manuscripts that were maintained there even after this era of avoiding the recording of the holy name. These manuscripts retain this name in Hebrew and Greek. We may ask this question now. I would want to take you to the texts that bear the name of the divine. Let's begin with the first collection of manuscripts, which is the Hebrew collection, which includes the writings that are known as the Masoretic letters. Jewish scribes known as the Masoretes were responsible for the introduction of a number of signs into the Hebrew writing system. These signs included certain indicators that indicated the sound of vowels. Consequently, in these manuscripts, which are known as media, we find a breakthrough in Hebrew writing that makes it a great deal simpler to capture the sound of words or the pronunciation of words. In addition, given that the proper name of the God of Israel appeared thousands of times in the Masoretic texts, we were able to see how the pronunciation of this name was recorded using this new notation. On the other hand, when we do so, we discover that the Codex Leningradensis has not just one but multiple different options. That is an example of an edition of the Hebrew Bible that was written using the Masoretic method. What we see is mostly the forms Yevi and Yovi, which is where the form Jehovah originates, which is a form that is used rather frequently in modern times, right? Jehovah is the source of this material. The difficulty is that modern scholars are in agreement that the vowel markers that we find in these samples that are there on the screen should not be taken as the vowels of the holy name itself. Instead, they suggest that other words should be uttered in lieu of the divine name. This disagreement is the source of the problem. For instance, the forms Ya and Yhovah would suggest that the word Adonai, which contains these vowels, ought to be pronounced in this manner. The fact that the term Elohim has these vowels would suggest that the word should be pronounced in this manner, right? The forms Yevi and Erovi would reflect this. Once more, in the spirit of avoiding the pronunciation of the name and something else, isn't it the case? Despite the fact that the Masoretic text may have really specified the vowels of the name itself, this would not be a guarantee that any of these or this is the case, right? We always know, for instance, that the Masoretes in the Middle Ages vocalized the name of Moses' sister as Miriam, but the Jews in Alexandria who translated the Bible into Greek in the times before Christ vocalized this name differently. This distinction is due to the fact that there are different forms, and these forms would actually have been the pronunciations of the divine name. They made a statement that was similar to Mariam. As a result of the fact that they recorded the vowel of the first syllable of this name using the Greek letter alpha, we are aware of them. When they transitioned from writing that did not include vowel signals to writing that did include vowel indications, which was Greek, they employed the letter alpha, which is the letter that produces the sound of the letter and in the word Mariam. Consequently, there is one thing that we are certain of, and that is the fact that the pronunciation of Hebrew in general, and the pronunciation of Hebrew names in particular, including names of supernatural beings, has changed over the course of history. In light of the fact that the Masoretic texts do not provide a solution to this problem of pronunciation, we may take use of another resource, which is to investigate the manner in which writers who wrote in Greek during ancient times and consequently utilized a writing system that represented vowels composed the name of the God of Israel. And when we return to these Greek works once again, we see that there was a wide variety of notations of the divine name in the 1st century before Christ. For instance, an author by the name of Diodorus inscribed the name of this god using the letters Alpha and Omega, which is equivalent to something like Yao. Some Greek documents that were discovered among the manuscripts from the Dead Sea and that date back to the 3rd to the 1st century before Christ also include this same spelling. These texts were discovered in the Dead Sea. After then, Irenaeus of Lyon also inscribed the name with iota Alpha and Omega, while Clement of Alexandria and Orans of Alexandria had previously used these forms that you see on the screen that you're currently seeing. Afterwards, Porphyry utilized this one, and Epiphanius utilized these items. This last form, which was especially employed by Epiphanius, is quite intriguing because it sounds like Yave, which is a pronunciation that is already very similar to the form Jave, which is what is used in various Bibles in Portuguese today. Do you want to have a deeper understanding of the language process that results in these many forms that are displaying there on the screen? If so, then you should check out the interview that I had with Stephen Fortunato from the Glossconaut channel. In this interview, he discusses this topic in great detail, making use of his experience, right? For the purpose of this video, which is more condensed and summarized, it is sufficient to say the following. All of these Greek forms are possible ways of interpreting the 4-letter name that we find in Hebrew, which is called the Tetragrammaton, which simply means 4 letters. Linguists, who are polyglots, generally have a great deal of knowledge regarding the history of languages and Hebrew. It is crucial to note that although these are all potential ways of translating the name, it is also necessary to point out that they are all incomplete. This is due to the fact that there are some sounds in the Hebrew language that cannot be represented by any Greek letter. This is a phrase that the Greeks used to refer to this name. Therefore, the individual who is making the transition from one form specified to another is not committed to making a mistake in this particular instance. It's only that there wasn't a means to convey, for instance, the sound of rho in Yahoo, for example. This is the case. It is therefore the case that the Greek would write Yahoo since he is unable to utilize Greek lettering to convey that particular R sound in Yahoo. However, regardless of this, the lesson to be learned from the narrative is that the Greek documentary testimony is not adequate to answer the question of how the name of the God of Israel was pronounced in ancient times. Despite the fact that it provides crucial hints, it does not complete the transaction. First, let's speak about the meaning of this name, which can also provide some fascinating hints about how to pronounce it. Once we've done that, we can move on to the conclusion. One possible place to begin is with the meaning that the majority of people are familiar with for this name, which is found in the book of Exodus. On a mountain, Moses has a vision in which he encounters a deity who makes a promise to save the Israelites, who are defined as Moses' people, from the state of servitude in which they were living in Egypt. In light of this promise, Moses poses a question that is ideally suited to the polytheistic milieu in which he lived. The question is as follows. When I go to the Israelites and say, "The God of your father has sent me to you," and they ask me, "What is your name, the name of God?" I shall say that I am the God of the Israelites. The response that he hears from God is as follows, "I am he who is," or "I am who I am," or "I will be who I will be." In a nutshell, there are a few different options available to him. On the other hand, the presence of the verb to be is what is important to us in this context, and so we should proceed, right? God stated, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am he has sent me to you." God also said to Moses, "Thus shall the Israelites say, Yahweh," or as you choose to pronounce the God of your father. Fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is how you will call me from generation to generation. Well, this is the translation of the Jerusalem Bible, right? As I said, there are several other possibilities, but the important thing is to realize that there is a play on words here in the text where the verb to be or to be in the form that appears there in Hebrew in the first person is I am, or I am, or I will be, or I will be. And these possibilities here because there is no specific verb tense for the present in Hebrew, and there is also no distinction between to be and to be. The context is what will define it, and this same verb in the third person is I. So one reading of this text would be that the divine name means he is or he will be, which occurs in parallel there in the text with the I am or I will be, which is said before. So if the idea is really that the pronunciation of the divine name would have to be similar enough to the pronunciation of the verb to be in the third person I for this play on words to make sense, right? For God to first say I am and then I will, or something like that, like Yahoo. Having said that, it is also important to point out that not all historians are of the opinion that the account that is found in Exodus genuinely recounts the original meaning of the heavenly name. It is also conceivable that the author of this text from Exodus was merely engaging in what is known as popular etymology. This is essentially the process of redefining the meaning of a word in such a way that people no longer possess the ability to recall what the name originally meant. The Bible is not an exception to this rule. In fact, it is fairly prevalent in ancient literature in general. It would appear that there are other potential alternatives, right? A number of historians have proposed it, but there is nothing that can be considered particularly substantial in the current level of academic study neither. A proper name that appears for the first time in the archaeological record in the 9th century BC and that was pronounced all the time given the need to specify who exactly is your god or your gods in a polytheistic context is the name that is commonly used to refer to the God who is commonly referred to as simply God today. In other words, the God who is commonly referred to as simply God today was simply and purely historically called by something more specific. Since the 3rd century BC, at the very least, people have been avoiding the name of this God and replacing it with other terms such as Adonai, which means right, Lord, or Elohim, which means God. In addition, this has made it far more difficult to maintain the correct pronunciation of this name. It is even possible to try to recover this pronunciation to some extent, taking into consideration the ancient records that we have of it as well as the semantic origin of the name as well as its meaning. However, there is nothing that can be considered absolutely definitive. This is due to the fact that, as we have seen, this name, just like any other name or word in any language, has had different pronunciations over the course of time and space. Currently, the most usual worldwide academic reconstruction is something along the lines of Yahweh, or in Portuguese, Yave or Jave. Nonetheless, it is important to note that the history of this word pertains to more than just these pronunciations. The fact of the matter is that over the course of history, there have been several approaches of writing, pronouncing, comprehending the meaning, and dealing with this name in a religious manner. We appreciate you taking the time to watch, and we hope to see you in the future video.